Thank you very much for coming out today, ladies and gentlemen and excellencies. And thank you very much to KFAS and President Paal for organizing this very responsible and interesting conference. Thank you for coming out on a beautiful day and showing your interest in this subject. Today we have the challenge of analyzing the divergent interests of the various parties engaged in the North Korean security scene. Our organizers have urged us to assess the potential for managing the emerging security dilemma and for preventing a nuclear chain reaction in the region. Before focusing on the Korean Peninsula, I'd like to take a few steps back briefly to put this set of issues in a context. First, the global security setting is trending toward fragmentation and instability. I can cite Russia or the Middle East. Asia is still relatively stable and prosperous, but the US and China are groping for a formula on how to accommodate China's rise while retaining the region's sources of stability. China's transition to a new normal of economic growth and the fate of the Trans-Pacific Partnership are still uncertain. Second, there are at least 3 emerging security dilemmas between China and the US and China's neighbors. In the South China Sea, as mentioned before, the stimulus and response cycle of your so-called defense measures are offensive against me, so I must take my own defensive steps against you. And this is at a well-developed stage at this point with Secretary of Defense Carter in the Philippines today. Though the material stakes are seemingly minuscule, islets and shoals, the competition is becoming a proxy for a much larger competition. In the Taiwan Strait, we are about to see a new era of uncertainty with a latent security dilemma compounded by a huge gap in strength between Taipei and Beijing and implied security assurances from Washington for Taipei. Here on the Korean Peninsula, we are entering an incipient new cycle of the security dilemma. It should not be surprising that Pyongyang's demonstrations of new threats are leading Democratic Seoul and Washington to look to protect their people, possibly through deployment of THAAD missile defense systems. Beijing also, unsurprisingly, sees that possibility as diminishing its deterrence and therefore its defense capability. Third, in this broader context, the Chinese and American leaders have repeatedly stated their willingness to accommodate the interests of each other and to avoid having our acknowledged and serious differences over these and other regional issues lead to a big power conflict. Now, if what I've just said is a correct characterization of the overall situation, we appear to be heading into an extended period of a kind of twilight zone of proxy contestation between the US and China in Asia, including here in Northeast Asia. Leaders thus far appear to be willing to compartmentalize each of these areas of emerging security dilemmas. At the end of the last session, there was some talk about mixing Taiwan and other issues. Though unofficial commentators in China might do so, so far, responsible officials are not offering trade-offs such as help me with Taiwan and I'll be together with you on North Korea, or how can we be tough with Pyongyang when you challenge our claims in the South China Sea. This apparent restraint, in my experience, probably reflects a realization that doing so will only make each problem tougher to wrestle with. But we should not forget completely that dealing with discrete regional issues nonetheless implies effects on the underlying big power competition for influence. Now, we have just witnessed an extraordinary episode in China's relations with North Korea. After a prolonged cooling off period following the execution of Jang Sung-taek, Beijing and Pyongyang appeared headed for a rapprochement of sorts last fall. Politburo Standing Committee member Liu Yunshan attended anniversary commemorations standing next to Kim Jong-un, and Kim exhibited restraint in those public remarks and activities on issues sensitive to China, such as missile launches and nuclear weapons. so long as Liu was there. This led many in China to conclude that Kim was more rational in behavior, secure in his authority, and prepared to meet Beijing halfway. By early December, knowledgeable Chinese anticipated a possible visit by Kim to Beijing before or after the upcoming Workers' Party Congress. But just as quickly as a new normal in relations between Pyongyang and Beijing appeared to be coming into the scene, it disappeared in disagreements that at first seemed superficial, the contents of a North Korean girl band's performance in Beijing, and then became deadly serious with Kim's announcement and subsequent testing of a claimed H-bomb capability, followed by the UN-proscribed satellite launch. Beijing, to me, at first seemed to be in shock over this sudden switch in the signals. There was detectable displeasure at hurried remarks by Secretary of State John Kerry about the failure of China's approach to the North, followed by an extraordinary effort by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi to pressurize his counterpart here in Seoul. Xi Jinping did not avail himself of the hotline to President Park, despite her government's indication of a desire to communicate directly. The Chinese permanent representative to the UN seemed uninstructed for weeks about how to shape Resolution 2270 of the Security Council, laying forth the new sanctions to respond to the North's provocations. It is difficult for me to assess what the internal deliberation process was going on in Beijing during the gap between the nuclear test and subsequent Chinese cooperation on Resolution 2270. Was it a feature of the way Xi Jinping has taken personal responsibility for so much of China's foreign policy? Was it the ambiguity of China's new foreign policy making process? Was it something else? In any event, it appears that some combination of factors suddenly ended Beijing's initial period of shock at the provocations of Kim Jong-un. I do not know whether it was President Obama's call to Xi on February 5 to urge cooperation on the resolution, as some American officials believe, or it was China's reaction to the insulting treatment given to Special Negotiator on North Korea, Ambassador Wu Dawei, after he returned to Beijing on February 4th. Whatever the explanation, the period that started with sending Liu Yunshan to Pyongyang had ended and a new phase begun. Early signs of enhanced Chinese enforcement of the newly authorized sanction lead to hopes in Seoul and Washington that Beijing may be closer to resolving the security dilemma it has long faced regarding North Korea. That is, whether to put denuclearization and its threats to Chinese security interests first, or to continue to nurture regime stability in the North. When Xi and Obama met on March 31st, the Chinese leader reinforced his message of seriousness about implementing the sanctions to which Beijing had agreed, but he quickly reverted to classic and familiar points about stability on the Korean Peninsula. From this episode and the preceding Jiangsung-Tek experience, one is forced to conclude that an underlying entente among the US, Korea, and China about how to deal existentially with North Korea and reunification is going to remain elusive. This should not be terribly surprising. Geography dictates that China and North Korea, despite their many frictions and animosities, will still be neighbors long after the nuclear issue is resolved one way or another. Beijing has little prospect for close alliances with its many neighbors, and thus is accustomed to managing its interests in less than satisfactory situations. China's relative and absolute power are growing. Those of the US and its allies are perceived to be in relative decline. This combination of considerations presumably disposes Beijing to believe that time is on its side. Resolution of the future of the Korean Peninsula therefore would be premature. China's terms can only improve through delay. This leads me to the near to medium-term conclusion, barring major and unexpected changes in China itself, that foreign and security policy challenges regarding the Korean Peninsula are going to be matters of management and not solutions. Implicit in China's agreement to Resolution 2270 and to its conditional enforcement is that the military capabilities the North is acquiring are not in China's interest, but not yet of an existential nature for China. This suggests that Beijing perceives Pyongyang to be difficult and headed in the wrong direction, but there is still room for China to exercise its influence positively on Kim's long-term behavior. So, now we confront the reemergence of a security dilemma on the Korean Peninsula among the very parties who are meant to cooperate in reducing the North's threat to regional stability. In my view, it was inevitable that the leaders of two democracies, the Republic of Korea and the United States, have no choice but to explore the possibility of deploying missile defenses to protect their populations from the new threats. How could they do otherwise? It is no secret that Beijing has put tremendous pressure on Seoul not to deploy THAAD. There are implicit threats that deployment will cost Korea in its relations with China. And China's state control system gives it a wide array of tools with which to express displeasure, economic, political, and otherwise. So one question is how to mitigate the Chinese reaction. President Obama conveyed to Chairman Xi that the U.S. has neither the intent nor THAAD the capability to damage China's security interests on the peninsula. He offered to send a team of specialists to explain the technical capabilities of the system. And there is an opportunity to do so in June in Beijing at the planned Strategic Security Dialogue and Strategic Economic Dialogue. Given the extensive misinformation in the Chinese media and underlying distrust, this will not be just one-time effort to try to persuade Beijing. Seoul has a role to play, of course. Since the cessation of the Korean War, Seoul has never envisioned the U.S. alliance as more than primarily defensive against the threat from the North. Even as the Republic of Korea has enlarged its horizons for security cooperation with the U.S. and others, it has not been my experience that an ROK leader would find his or her interest in developing a capability to use against China directly. This frames the potential for a sort of negative security assurance that Seoul's leader can offer Beijing. Again, this will require a diplomatically persistent effort to convey the message. There are voices in Japan and Korea who question long-standing rejection of nuclear weapons capabilities in light of the growing threat from North Korea. So many believe that until Beijing sees that the region may go nuclear in response to the North, it will not be adequately motivated to protect its own interest in preventing such proliferation. For me, I understand the frustration with self-restraint and also the tactical utility of alerting Beijing to the danger of not being more firm with Pyongyang. But I suspect, unfortunately, that the Chinese, as I do, will conclude this is more a bluff than a real security option for Tokyo and Seoul. States that lack strategic depth and live in dense environments are, in my view, significantly better off relying on the American security umbrella than developing their own capabilities. Their energy would be better rewarded by managing their relationship with Washington in light of the emerging threat. And Washington has an obligation to demonstrate that it's managing its capability to project the umbrella despite the manifest challenges at home and abroad. There are many other points to discuss in this session this afternoon, and the chairman has given us the challenge to do so, but I'll leave it at this. Thank you very much.